So welcome to this video presentation on the comparison of the Gospels, this one focusing on the Passion narratives in the Gospels. So the reason why the Passion narratives are important is because that's one of those crucial building blocks of the Gospels. When you look at how the authors of the Gospels really put their stories together, the way they build their case for who Jesus is and what he's all about and what we're supposed to take from it, they construct these using these building blocks, the first of which are parables, then we have miracle stories, the Passion narrative, and then that material that's unique to each of them, some of which is going to be found right in the Passion narratives themselves. So when we take a look at Passion narratives, we need to remember that conflict is a huge driving force for narrative. So much of what we understand about who Jesus is, what Jesus does, and what really drives the lessons forward, drives the story forward, is the conflict that he enters into with the people through the community as he engages in his ministry. And there's probably no greater source of conflict than when he is arrested, tried, and eventually killed for his beliefs and what he's trying to teach and what he's trying to show people. It really gets at the essence of what Jesus' mission is all about when he is at this point where he's being called into account for what he is and what he's doing. And there's really some question going on in the Passion narrative as well about who is responsible for what. How much of this is Jesus doing, God's doing? Is it the Romans? Is it the Jews? Who is responsible for what's going on, and who's responsible for taking things into account? So when Jesus is arrested, he is brought to trial, and all four Gospels, all Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all have Pilate ask Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus responds, "You have said so." John adds a further element where he says, my kingship is not of this world, for I have come into this world to bear witness to the truth. But in all of these cases, he's point blank asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he really refuses to answer the question. He says, "You have said so." But that's where it deviates. From that point forward, Mark and Matthew both have Pilate say, "Don't you see these charges against you? Don't you recognize what is being done to you?" And they're going to immediately then go on to the scene with Jesus and Barabbas. Luke and John both handle this a little differently. Luke and John both have Pilate respond with, "I find no crime against this man," being the first of many times that's going to hint at their focus on Jesus' innocence. Rather than having him be handed over and talk, or rather than immediately go into the discussion with Jesus or Barabbas, Luke is going to have Jesus handed over to Herod. And really, it's going to make this a much larger scale trial. It's going to make it bigger in scope. This is more than just being a little skirmish with the Jews. This is something that's grander because, but again, then what happens? Luke has Jesus handed back over to Pilate. Pilate again says, "I find this man guilty of none of the charges against him." So it really hints at it's a bigger story for Luke, but the innocence is a huge part of it. When they are talking about the choice between Jesus or Barabbas, each one is portrayed a little bit differently as well. In Mark, the crowd is given the chance, the choice to free Jesus, and Mark acknowledges that Pilate says the only reason Jesus is here is because he's made the chief priests envious, jealous, and he gives them that opportunity, but the crowds shout out for Barabbas' release instead, and cry for Jesus to be crucified. So Pilate did this, and it's very clear he did this to satisfy the crowd. So there's this view of Pilate sort of being the one who's responsible for this. He's just doing this to pacify the crowd, and he knows that the reason that he's doing this is for the jealousy of the chief priest, but he goes along with it anyway. Matthew adds a little bit of a different element to it, because Matthew has including having the wife of Pilate warn him, have nothing to do with this Jesus fellow because of the dream that she's had. Matthew clearly has Pilate offer up a choice to the people and say, would you want me to free Jesus or Barabbas? And the people say, free Barabbas and crucify Jesus. So it seems to place more responsibility on the Jews. They even to the point of saying, let his blood be on our hands, let his blood be on our children. And Pilate, your hands are washed of this. A lot of what is made out of this is it's said that Matthew comes across as a very anti-Jewish gospel, and there's some case to be made for that, but nonetheless, Mark has a more passive. Mark has the more active sort of, they cry out, crucify him, whereas Matthew's a little bit more passive, let him be crucified. I think it's probably unfair when you're looking at it to say that Matthew comes across as more anti-Jewish. It comes across more like he's holding the Jews responsible in a way. He has higher expectations of them, which would make sense, being a Jew himself and being a strong follower of the idea of keeping to the spirit of the law and leading the Jewish people. He would hold them to a higher standard, and it seems to be in this case he's holding them to a higher standard and they're failing to live up to that because he's putting the responsibility on them. In the case of Luke, Pilate continues to hit home Jesus' innocence. Pilate says, no fewer than 3 times, this man is innocent. I find no charges against him. I'm going to release him. And the crowd shouts out, no! And he says, I really don't see anything wrong. I'm going to go ahead and release him. And the crowd says, no! Each time. And John likewise really hits at this innocence of Jesus. But Jesus also outright rejects to acknowledge that any of this has any authority over him. He says to them, you can do what you will to me, but no power has been given to you that was not granted to you by God or willed to you by God. So God's will is really going to be what's going to rule here. Then Jesus, when he is crucified, he's crucified among the other criminals, and even the other criminals that he's crucified alongside deride him and mock him, along with the crowds. Luke is the one that has one of the criminals recognize Jesus and become loyal and allegiant to him, and even on the cross, and saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I'm going to pay honor to you and see you as my king, as my savior. And Jesus says, truly I say to you that today you will be with me in paradise. And then Jesus dies. When he dies, his final words are interesting because they tell us a lot. His final words in Matthew and Mark are, my God, why have you forsaken me? He dies in despair and he cries out. And then the people recognize when the centurion looks and says, truly, this man was the Son of God. Now this is a big moment of anticipation for Matthew, because Matthew's going to go right into the resurrection. And he has this big story to tell after this. But in Mark, you don't really have that big resurrection story afterward, because for Mark, the focus of the story isn't on the resurrected Jesus. The focus of the story is on Jesus as the sacrifice, this sacrificed Jesus who suffered for us. So this is really the point that he's hitting home. Luke, however, has Jesus die as a champion, content that the work he has come to do is complete. And his last words are, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Really, it's about release, not suffering. And when the centurion sees Jesus, he doesn't respond with, surely this man was the Son of God. He responds with, truly this man was innocent, hitting one more time this whole idea of Jesus' innocence. Likewise, Jesus, in the Gospel of John, he bows his head and says, it is finished, and dies. Because for John, this isn't really the end. That's the ironic part in saying, it is finished, because this isn't the end. Jesus will rise, and the people will believe and receive new life. So Luke and John and Matthew have much more of a focus on anticipation of the resurrection that's to come. And Luke and John definitely more focus on the innocence of Jesus. Luke and John have a much larger scale view of things. Luke putting it on a grander scale, looking at him as the new champion. And really each of these stories have a lot to indicate for us the very different focus and how this one act, although it's the same in all of them, can mean a lot to different people. So thank you very much for watching this presentation, and I hope you enjoy it.